On a humid June night in New Delhi, the lights in one small Lutyens bungalow are still burning, long after the capital has gone to sleep. Inside, a 70-year-old man sits alone at a desk, a pile of secret files in front of him. His white kurta is perfectly pressed, but his shoulders are slightly stooped, as if decades of history have settled there and refused to leave. On the top page, in red pencil, someone has underlined a single sentence: foreign exchange reserves, less than 2 weeks of imports. Outside, the air is thick with the sound of distant generators and barking dogs. Inside, the silence is broken only by the slow, tired scritch of a fountain pen and the faint ticking of a wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. In 72 hours, his party will choose its new leader. In less than a month, India might default and plunge into economic chaos. And somewhere across the city, in another bungalow, his chief rival is already gathering supporters, working the phones, promising posts. 2 men, 1 throne, and a country on the brink. This is not where P.V. Narasimha Rao had planned to be. Just weeks earlier, he had quietly packed his books, told his staff he was retiring from politics, and prepared to disappear into the shadows as just another forgotten ex-minister. No dynasty behind him, no mass base, no crowd chanting his name. He was supposed to be done. Now, in the middle of the night, the fate of nearly 800 million people is being balanced on the calm, unreadable face of a man who, for most of his life, had been easy to overlook. How does a shy Telugu-speaking village boy, born in a princely state under a feudal ruler, end up here, counting the hours before a financial collapse, locked in a silent race against a younger, more charismatic competitor? To answer that, we have to go back, far back, to a village where the sky seemed endless, books were scarce, and power belonged to men who never dirtied their hands. The place is Lakhnapali in the Nizam's Hyderabad state, sometime in the early 1920s. Dust hangs in the air like a permanent fog. The land is rich, but the people are not. Fields of cotton and jowar stretch out under a burning sun, but most of what grows here belongs to someone else. In a small tiled roof house, a child is born in June 1921. His birth name is Pamalaparti Venkata Narasimha Rao. From the very beginning, his life is shaped by the quiet violence of tradition. While he is still a boy, he is adopted by childless relatives in another village, Vangara. No one explains much. In those days, such things are decided by elders, not children. One day he has one home. The next day he has another. For a sensitive child, it is a subtle, almost invisible rupture, but it plants something deep in him, a sense of distance, of watching rather than belonging, of seeing every room from just half a step outside the circle. Vangara becomes his world. Mornings start before sunrise. The call of birds, the creak of bullock carts, the murmur of women at the well. The boy is small, with thoughtful eyes that seem to absorb everything. Other children race to the fields, inventing games with stones and sticks. He sneaks off to a different playground, any place that has words. A temple inscription, a torn newspaper, a school book abandoned under a tree. He doesn't just read, he devours. Telugu, his mother tongue, comes first. The rhythm of its poetry, the depth of its idioms, the stories from the Mahabharata and Ramayana that village elders recite under the banyan tree at night. Then comes Marathi, floating across the border from nearby regions. Urdu, the language of the Nizam's court, snakes through official notices, police commands, and the clipped orders of officers on horseback. He listens, he memorizes, he imitates. The boy who barely speaks in public begins, in private, to hold entire conversations with himself in different tongues. Language becomes his secret superpower, a weapon no one can see. Around him, the world is brutally simple. On one side of the village live the landlords, the Doras. Their house is raised slightly higher, literally looking down on everyone else. On the other side live the peasants, bent over in the fields, always at someone's mercy. Between them stands the Nizam's state, a distant Urdu-speaking power backed by its own police, its own jails, its own fear. From an early age, Narasimha Rao understands 2 things. Power speaks a different language, and those who don't understand it get crushed. For a boy from such a background, education is not a right. It's a negotiation, a gamble, sometimes a rebellion. There are no elite English medium schools waiting for him. Instead, there is the local pathshala, then a series of moves, a progression from village to small town to city, each step a little. Miracle powered by stubbornness and mark sheets. In Karimnagar, he studies harder than anyone else, sitting under a flickering oil lamp long after other students have surrendered to sleep. Someone remembers him as the boy who always carried a book, even on the way to the fields, reading as he walked, occasionally tripping, but never letting go of the page. Then comes a bigger leap. College in Pune, at Ferguson College, a universe away from Vangara. Here the air hums with politics. In the hostel corridors, students argue late into the night about Gandhi and Nehru, about socialism and capitalism, about the future of a country that is still chained to an empire. Newspapers from Bombay and Calcutta arrive a day late but are passed from hand to hand like contraband. In the canteen, one topic returns again and again. What about the princely states? British India is stirring. But the princes, including the powerful Nizam of Hyderabad, still rule their fiefdoms like medieval kings. For them, freedom is a word for others. For Narasimha Rao, it is personal. He has seen with his own eyes how the Nizam's laws work. The casual humiliation of Telugu-speaking peasants by Urdu-speaking officials, at the way a landlord's word outweighs a dozen testimonies, the fear that falls on a village when the police jeep appears at the end of the road. In Pune, he discovers something else. He is not just good at languages, he is extraordinarily good. He picks up Marathi with ease, then Hindi, then slowly, carefully, English, not as the language of rulers, but as a key to books that were previously locked away from him. He reads law, philosophy, political theory. He underlines entire pages, fills notebooks with notes in a neat, tight hand. Other students enjoy the thrill of current debates. He reads as if time is running out, because back home, it is. While he is still a student, the currents of history begin to swirl faster around Hyderabad. On the one side is the Nizam, fiercely resisting any talk of merging his state with a future independent India. On the other are nationalists and local Congress workers, banned from organizing openly, forced into secrecy. And in the background, growing like a storm cloud, is another force. The communists, especially in the Telangana region, mobilizing. Peasants against landlords preparing for armed struggle. When Narasimha Rao returns to Hyderabad after his studies, he steps into a boiling cauldron. He could have taken the safer path. He had the education to become a successful lawyer, to build a respectable practice, to keep his opinions within the four walls of his office. Instead, he does something that will define his life. He chooses to walk into danger quietly, without drama, with the same calm face he will one day carry into the Prime Minister's office. He joins the underground Congress movement in Hyderabad state. Working under the shadow of the Nizam's ban, meetings are held at odd hours, in back rooms behind shuttered shops. Messages are passed in code, routes are changed at the last minute. The risk is real: arrest, torture, disappearance. Here, the boy from Vangara discovers another part of himself. He is not a fiery orator, not the kind of leader who can whip up a crowd with a single slogan. Instead, he is the one drafting leaflets late into the night, studying legal loopholes that can be used against oppressive policies, quietly composing arguments that others will speak aloud. Words, once his private escape, become his public weapon. At the same time, he is watching the communists with wary fascination. In village after village, peasants are beginning to fight back, sometimes with stones, sometimes with guns. Landlords are attacked, their granaries looted. The Telangana armed struggle is brutal, chaotic, driven by desperation. He understands the rage. He also sees the cost. In the space of a few months, entire villages can change hands 3 times. Landlord, communist, Nizam's forces. Each shift is accompanied by purges, beatings, reprisals. Ordinary people pay the price. It is in this furnace that Narasimha Rao's political instinct is forged. A deep belief that change must come, but that it must be structured. Are negotiated, embedded in law, not just forced at gunpoint. It will be decades before that instinct reshapes India's economy. For now, it shapes the choices of a young activist walking a very thin line between collaboration and confrontation. 1947 arrives, and with it the moment so many have dreamed of. British rule in India ends. Firecrackers in Bombay, tricolors in Delhi, speeches in the Constituent Assembly. But in Hyderabad, the Nizam clings on. For one strange, tense year, freedom and feudalism coexist. India is independent, Hyderabad is not. Rumors spread quickly. Will India intervene? Will there be war? The Nizam's paramilitary force, the Razakars, begins to terrorize villages, declaring loyalty to their ruler and, increasingly, to their own commanders. In the middle of this, the young lawyer activist from Vangara keeps working, now in the open, now underground, navigating a landscape where the line between political activity and sedition is decided by whoever has the most guns at that moment. Then, in 1948, the Indian Army moves. Operation Polo, the police action, brings Hyderabad into the Indian Union within days. The Nizam surrenders. Formally, the crisis is over. On the ground, it is not. In the countryside, communal tensions, old feuds, and armed groups spinning out of control leave scars that will last for generations. Narasimha Rao travels through some of these areas and sees again the cost of delayed justice. The dream of a just state cannot remain a dream. It must become law, and law must become power. Barely 30 years old, he makes another quiet pivot. He steps directly into electoral politics. 1952, the first elections in the newly democratic India. In Hyderabad state, Congress is reorganizing, searching for faces who can bridge the gap between elite leadership and rural masses. Here is a man who has seen struggle from below, who can speak to peasants in their own idiom, but who can also quote legal clauses and Sanskrit verse. They persuade him, almost push him, to stand for the Legislative Assembly from Karimnagar. Campaigning is chaotic. There are no glossy posters, no television channels, no social media, only feet and voices and the occasional crackling loudspeaker tied to the top of a jeep. Narasimha Rao walks. From village to village, house to house, field to field. He is not a natural campaigner. His voice is low, his delivery measured, his body language restrained. Some party workers are worried. People want passion, one of them mutters. Our main opponent shouts. He does dramas on the stage. You give lectures. But slowly something interesting happens. The villagers listen. They are used to promises shouted from a distance. They are not used to a candidate who comes, sits down at the threshold and asks questions. Who listens more than he speaks? Who remembers faces and names when he comes again? On election day, the ballot boxes are heavy. When they are finally opened and counted, the result is clear. The quiet lawyer has done the unthinkable. He has won. He enters the Hyderabad State Assembly not with fanfare, but with a notebook and a resolve to figure out how this complicated machine, called government, actually works. Inside, he discovers another world of rivalry. There are older leaders who see him as a useful junior, a file pusher. There are louder colleagues who believe speeches matter more than policy. There are those who resent his education, mocking him behind his back as the professor, hinting that he doesn't understand real politics. Among them is one particularly flamboyant minister, a man who can summon crowds by simply announcing his arrival. He becomes, in many ways, Narasimha Rao's first political competitor. Where the older politician uses drama, Rao uses detail. If his rival can shake hands with 1,000 people in an hour, Rao can read a 1,000-page report overnight. In cabinet meetings, when others grow impatient at the mention of land reforms, tenancy laws, irrigation projects, he has already read every clause, every footnote, every historical precedent. When landlords pressure the government to dilute a bill, he quietly points to a line that makes such dilution illegal. Slowly, ministers who used to dismiss him as a bookworm begin to see something else, a mind that can hold enormous complexity and produce simple, actionable decisions. It is a pattern that will repeat throughout his life. He will rarely be the most visible man in the room, but increasingly he will be the one others come to when the shouting is over and the real work has to be done. As the 1950s turn into the 1960s, India changes again. The old Hyderabad state is dismantled. Linguistic reorganization redraws the map. Telugu-speaking regions from different political histories, Telangana from Hyderabad state and Andhra from Madras, are on a path to be merged into one, Andhra Pradesh. On paper, it is a triumph for linguistic identity. On the ground, it is complicated. Telangana peasants, including many who had bled in the struggle against the Nizam and landlords, fear being dominated by richer, better, educated elites from coastal Andhra. They worry that once again decisions will be made in a distant city, in accents that are not their own. This time, Narasimha Rao is not an outside observer. He is in the thick of it. A legislator, a minister, a man whose signature or silence can alter the fate of millions. The clock is ticking. In a matter of months, perhaps weeks, the final decision on the merger will be taken. There are meetings, committees, reports. Delegations come, plead, threaten. Some urge total opposition. Others argue that unity is destiny, that delay will only weaken all sides. He reads every proposal, listens to every argument, carries the weight of two histories on his narrow shoulders, the memory of Telangana, as suffering under a feudal rule and the dream of a strong united Telugu state. Whatever he chooses, someone will call it a betrayal. In quiet moments, he thinks back to Vangara, of what it means to be shifted from one home to another without fully understanding why. Now he is helping to move entire regions. Ultimately, he supports the creation of Andhra Pradesh, but pushes for safeguards for Telangana, a complex, fragile compromise. History will judge that compromise harshly. Decades later, the movement for a separate Telangana will resurrect old grievances and paint leaders like him as men who failed the region. But in that moment, he is not playing a long game of legacy. He is a minister with limited time, limited power, and the urgent need to prevent immediate collapse. It will not be the last time he has to choose between imperfect options under a shrinking deadline. By the late 1960s, the boy from Vangara has become one of the key figures in Andhra Pradesh politics. He has held various portfolios, law, education, information. He has built a reputation as a reformer, especially in land and education, quietly seeking to reduce the stranglehold of big landlords and expand opportunities for the rural poor. He introduces changes that anger many of the old elite: land ceilings, tenancy protections, administrative tweaks that seem small on paper but massive to those whose power rests on centuries of unquestioned privilege. Behind closed doors, they curse him. In public, they smile. In party corridors, whispers grow louder. Some say he is too radical, pushing too hard, too fast. Others complain he is too slow, too cautious, too willing to balance. They don't see the full map inside his head, the one that stretches from his village to the assembly, from the raised fields of Telangana to the committee rooms in Delhi. What they do see is this: in meeting after meeting, this quiet man holds the floor, not by volume but by clarity. He does not dominate, but he shapes, not with slogans but with sentences that begin, "If we look at the data." Gradually, his stature grows beyond the state. Word reaches Delhi. A prime minister in the making, Indira Gandhi, notices the minister from Andhra who combines ideological commitment with administrative skill. She is building her own power base, looking for loyalists who can be trusted not just to win elections but to govern. Within Andhra Pradesh, party factions sharpen their knives. They know that if he rises further, it will be at someone's expense. Some of those someones have been waiting their entire careers for a shot at the top job. They are not about to let a bookish, soft-spoken rival walk past them. In 1971, after a period of intense infighting, crisis, and calculations that only a few insiders ever fully understand, the decision is made. The high command in Delhi points its finger at P. V. Narasimha Rao. He is to be the next chief minister of Andhra Pradesh. As he stands on the brink of taking the oath, there are men in the room who smile for the cameras and clench their fists in their pockets. One of them leans over to an aide and whispers, "Let him enjoy it. He won't last." What none of them can see, what not even Narasimha Rao himself fully realizes, is that this is just the beginning of a journey that will take him from the dust of Vangara to the darkest economic crisis independent India has ever faced. The journey that will end one day in that small bungalow in Delhi with a stack of files, a ticking clock, and a rival racing him for control of a crumbling system. For now, though, the oath awaits. The stage lights burn bright. The soft-spoken man clears his throat, steps forward, and walks into a storm that will test every lesson his life has taught him so far. The first time PV, Narasimha Rao, tastes absolute power, it does not feel like triumph. It feels like standing in the eye of a cyclone. Outside the Andhra Pradesh Secretariat in Hyderabad, a sea of protesters is roaring itself hoarse. Some carry red flags, some black, some tricolors with angry slogans scrawled across Gandhi's face. In the distance, the siren of an ambulance cuts through the heat-heavy air. Inside, behind thick wooden doors and dusty curtains, the new chief minister sits alone at a long table, a single sheet of paper in front of him. On it, in clean bureaucratic prose, is one simple recommendation: impose prohibitory orders. Police authorized to use force. He knows what that sentence means in real life. Lothus cracking skulls, gunshots in narrow lanes, blood on the steps of college buildings. There is a deadline. By dawn, the student unions have promised to shut down Hyderabad completely. By midday, the strike will spread to the coastal districts. By nightfall, if nothing is done, Delhi might decide that Andhra Pradesh is ungovernable and send its own answer. President's rule. His government dissolved with a single signed order. He looks at the clock. It is almost midnight. Somewhere else in the same building, a younger, camera-friendly Congress leader is working the phones, pacing up and down the corridor, his voice rising and falling theatrically as he talks to Delhi. He can't handle it, this rival says, loud enough for a few ears to overhear. I told you he is a professor, not a leader. If this goes wrong, we will need a new chief minister, someone who can control the streets. 2 men, 1 post, a state on fire. The shy boy from Vangara has never been closer to the center of the storm. The oath ceremony had been deceptive. On that day in 1971, the stage had been full of smiles. Garlanded leaders, party workers pushing forward to touch his feet, photographers jostling to get the right angle. The new chief minister had raised his hand, repeated the constitutional phrases in an even voice, and stepped back from the microphone, blinking against the flashbulbs. For a brief moment, it had almost felt like a culmination. From village to state capital, from underground activist to cabinet minister to the top job, it was a climb that, on paper, made sense. Reality, as usual, was less polite. Inheriting Andhra Pradesh meant inheriting all its unfinished conflicts at once. Drought in the Rayalaseema districts, disguised famine in the tribal belts, Naxalite squads in the forests, ambushing police parties, claiming to avenge centuries of exploitation. In the cities, students marching against unemployment, corruption, and what they called Andhra imperialism over Telangana. On his first full day as chief minister, file after file had landed on his desk, each thicker than the last, each representing a problem that had been postponed by his predecessors. Land reform bills that had been stalled in committee for years. Lists of surplus land that existed only on paper because powerful landlords had their own ways of hiding acreage. Reports of bonded labor in remote mandals, written in cautious bureaucratic language that did not fully convey the desperate chained lives behind the words. He had read them all late into the night under a yellowing lamp. The machine of the state did not intimidate him anymore. He knew its levers, its rust, its habits of resistance. But outside that office, there was another battlefield he had never fully mastered, the theater of politics. His main rival within the party, the same flamboyant minister who had thrived on stage shows and thunderous slogans, had not disappeared. When Delhi chose Rao for the top job, he had simply adapted. If Narasimha Rao's strength was detail, the other man's strength was drama. If Rao spent his evenings reading policy drafts, the rival spent his racing from rally to rally, hugging farmers, accepting garlands, promising instant solutions with the easy confidence of a man who never bothered to calculate the actual cost. In the era of headlines and loudspeakers, one of them made better pictures. Rao's response, as always, was to turn to work. He pushed land reform forward, reactivating long-dormant files, insisting that ceilings be enforced, that tenancy rights be recognized. He expanded educational opportunities, sanctioning new colleges in neglected districts, sending teams to survey where the state's invisible children were being left behind. He traveled constantly, not with a press circus, but with a small team of officials and a tattered briefcase. In village after village, under banyan trees and in crumbling government rest houses, he listened to delegations until late at night, unscribbling notes, asking questions that made it clear he had done his homework. On the ground, some people began to notice. Idaru ma uriki vachcharu, an old farmer told his neighbor. 2 of them came to our village. One stood on a jeep and shouted. The other sat on the floor and asked about the canal. But in the capital, the noise from the streets was growing louder. Drought deepened. Prices rose. Naxalite attacks intensified. In Telangana, disappointment festered over the safeguards that had accompanied the merger into Andhra Pradesh. Reserved jobs and educational quotas seemed to vanish somewhere between promise and implementation. The students came out first. One afternoon, a march that was supposed to be peaceful suddenly turned violent. Stones flew, police lathas swung. Someone panicked, someone shouted an order, and in the space of a minute that would never be fully reconstructed, rifles were fired. Into a crowd of young men who had left home that morning with slogans on their lips and exam forms in their pockets. Bodies on the asphalt. Mothers howling in hospital corridors, That night, sitting at his desk with reports arriving in a chaotic stream, Narasimha Rao felt something break inside. He had seen death before, during the Nizam's reign, during the police action, during the brutal days of the Telangana struggle. But now the weapons belonged to a government he headed. In public, he remained calm, announcing inquiries, compensation, appeals for peace. In private, he spent hours going through every line of the police reports, circling contradictions, demanding names. He did not believe in slogans about necessary force. He believed in responsibility. But responsibility in politics is a double-edged word. For his rival, it became an opportunity. He is weak, the rival told anyone who would listen. He is paralyzed by files. People are dying and he is still reading. Some of those complaints found their way to Delhi. Indira Gandhi, at the height of her centralizing power, did not like surprises. From her office in South Block, Andhra Pradesh was one of many pieces on the map. A crucial one, rich in seats and symbolism, but still one piece. She needed it stable, controllable, reliable. On the phone, her questions to Narasimha Rao were pointed and brief. How long will this continue? What are you doing about the student unrest? Are you in charge or is someone else? He knew the translations behind those sentences. I made you chief minister. Do not make me regret it. He also knew what was happening behind his back. Delegations from his own state began arriving in Delhi, carrying memos, letters, whispered complaints. They sought appointments with the prime minister, with her closest advisors, with anyone who would listen. They described a state in chaos, a chief minister out of touch, a government losing control. And always, floating just behind their words, was an unspoken suggestion. There were alternatives, other leaders, stronger leaders, leaders who could handle things. One of those alternatives made sure to be seen in the capital more often. He would arrive with clippings from newspapers, carefully selected to highlight failures. He would press them into the hands of key figures, his face appropriately grave, his tone heavy with reluctant criticism. I am not saying he is a bad man, the rival would explain, palms open in a gesture of wounded innocence. He is very learned, but sometimes in politics you need more than learning. In the end, it came down to a simple calculation in Delhi. Was the cost of keeping him higher than the cost of letting him go? The decision reached him in the same understated way that so much of his life had unfolded, not as a dramatic ultimatum, but as a quiet suggestion. Perhaps some said he might consider stepping down in the larger interest of the party. Perhaps a change of face would cool tempers. Perhaps he would be more valuable in another role. He understood immediately. He had options, at least on paper. He could dig in his heels, mobilize his own supporters, threaten to split the party in Andhra, force Delhi to choose between him and his rival in an open showdown. Others had done it. Some had even survived. Instead, he did something that baffled many of his contemporaries. He resigned. There was no fiery speech, no public accusation, no midnight sit-in. He walked into the Raj Bhavan, handed over his letter, and walked out, carrying nothing but a thin brown file and a small stack of personal papers. In the party corridors, his rival smiled wider than usual that day. Photographers caught him accepting congratulations, shaking hands, already speaking the language of responsibility, stability, unity. But if he thought that was the end of Narasimha Rao, he did not know the man he had helped push aside. The village boy had learned one lesson again and again. Power is not always where the lights are brightest. Sometimes it waits in the shadows, watching, learning, preparing for a different kind of battle. The years that followed were, on the surface, a step down. No chief ministerial motorcades, no crowds at helipads, no late-night convoys racing to handle crises. But in another sense, these were the years when P. V. Narasimha Rao moved on to a larger board. Indira Gandhi did not abandon him. She knew what he had given up and what he still had to offer. In the 1970s, as Congress reeled from factional wars and ideological splits, she needed people who understood both administration and the inner life of the party. She pulled him into organizational work, then into national roles. He became a general secretary of the All India Congress Committee, a troubleshooter sent to calm rebellions in distant states, a negotiator who could sit with warring factions for hours, listening, absorbing, slowly stitching together fragile compromises. Delhi was a different universe from Hyderabad. The gossip was sharper. The rivalries were more complex. Here, it was not enough to win elections. One had to navigate the moods of the high command, the shifting alliances of regional satraps, the ideological tempers of socialists, syndicalists, and hardline conservatives who all wore the same party badge. On the day Indira Gandhi declared the emergency in 1975, suspending civil liberties and jailing opposition leaders, he sat in a small room with a few other senior figures, listening to the announcement like a man hearing distant thunder. Publicly, he went along. He did not resign in protest. He did not give interviews of anguish. He did what he always did. He worked within the system as it existed, trying quietly to moderate wherever he could to prevent the worst abuses from getting official sanction. Privately, he was uneasy. He had fought the Nizam's repression, seen what unchecked police power could do. Now, in the name of saving democracy, his own party was using similar instruments. In later years, he would almost never speak at length about the emergency. It sat in his memory like a locked drawer. But those months taught him another hard lesson. Power without restraint does not just crush enemies. It decays its own source. When the voters of India threw Indira Gandhi out of office in 1977, it was a shock, but not a mystery. For many Congress politicians, the defeat was a sign to scatter. Some crossed over to the new rulers. Others quietly retired. Many slipped into a comfortable obscurity, convinced the era of Nehru-Gandhi dominance was finished. V. Narasimha Rao did what he had done since Vangara. He stayed and he worked. While Delhi gloated over Indira's fall, he traveled through the South, rebuilding organizational networks, reassuring party workers who had suddenly lost the oxygen of power. He sat in small-town offices with fading posters on the walls, telling tired men and women that cycles turn, that no defeat is final, if the party can still speak to the poor. 2 years later, when the Janata coalition collapsed under its own contradictions and Indira stormed back to power in 1980, she remembered who had stood by her in exile. She summoned Narasimha Rao to her new cabinet. This time, the village boy was not being asked to run a state. He was being handed the keys to India's place in the world. As External Affairs Minister, P. V. Narasimha Rao discovered a venue that suited him almost unnervingly well. Diplomacy, like law, lives in careful words. In conference halls from New York to Moscow to Geneva, he moved through conversations with an ease that startled foreign counterparts, who had expected a provincial politician. He spoke in measured English, deliberate and precise, switching to French, Spanish, or a smattering of Arabic when occasion demanded, always with that same unhurried, almost diffident manner that hit a razor-sharp recall of history and nuance. In Washington, he debated development with officials who had assumed Indian ministers only came to plead for aid. In Moscow, he navigated the delicate balance between ideology and interest, reassuring an anxious Soviet leadership that India's friendship would survive leadership changes on both sides. On long flights, while others relaxed, he went through thick briefing books, not just reading but annotating, underlining, adding pages of his own analysis. Diplomats who had grown used to ministers who skimmed summaries found themselves presented with detailed questions about obscure boundary clauses or trade provisions. Back home, however, the familiar pattern repeated. He was effective, but he was not flashy. Indira Gandhi valued him, but the dynastic machinery around her was already looking beyond the dependable administrator to a different kind of figurehead, one with a recognizable surname, a modern image, a face that could be turned into a poster of New India. After Sanjay Gandhi's sudden death in 1980, that figurehead had a name, Rajiv Gandhi. The airline pilot turned reluctant politician moved through Delhi with a different energy, a blend of youth, privilege, and the invisible glow of dynasty. Cameras followed him. Crowds surged around him. Within the party, lines began shifting around the gravitational pull of the next generation. Narasimha Rao watched quietly from the second row. He did not resent Rajiv. In many ways, he liked him, found him intelligent, well-meaning, serious. But he understood what his rise meant for men like himself, leaders without a mass base of their own, whose authority came from competence rather than charisma. In the old order, such men had value. In a world of television, advertising, and increasingly presidential-style politics, they were becoming staff. Useful, necessary, replaceable. Then, in 1984, everything changed in a cloud of gunpowder and blood. Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her own bodyguards. Delhi shook. The Congress Party reeled. Television screens filled with images of mourning and barely restrained chaos. Rajiv Gandhi was sworn in as prime minister within hours, as much to prevent a power vacuum as to honor a lineage. The old guard closed ranks around him, offering experience to shore up his inexperience. Among them was P.V. Narasimha Rao. He was moved into the Home Ministry, the nerve center of internal security. It was, in many ways, the most delicate portfolio in the cabinet of a country suddenly on edge. In the days that followed Indira's assassination, as horrific anti-Sikh riots erupted in Delhi, he sat in a flood of incoming reports. Arson, looting, murder, entire neighborhoods terrorized while the state machinery hesitated, stumbled, failed. To his dying day, critics would ask whether he had moved fast enough, pushed hard enough, shouted loud enough to stop the killing. He had his own version of those events. Calls made, orders issued, delays in the chain of execution. But the images were unforgiving. Burning gurdwaras, men dragged from homes, women staring into cameras with eyes that seemed to ask not just who had killed their families, but where the government of India had been while it happened. He carried that weight like another invisible file in the stack on his mind. As Home Minister, he also confronted armed insurgencies in Punjab and the Northeast, hostage situations, hijackings, the constant, grinding work of holding together a country of 100 languages and 1,000 resentments. While he worked, the atmosphere around Rajiv Gandhi changed. At first, Rajiv had come in promising clean politics, a government with a modern mind. People compared him to Kennedy, to other young leaders who symbolized freshness. Narasimha Rao, older, slower of speech, found himself increasingly sidelined in favor of a new court. Technocrats, corporate-friendly, advisors, bright-eyed computer boys who spoke the language of software and satellite television. Within the party, another rival to Rao's influence emerged, a different kind of competitor from his Andhra days. This one was urbane, telegenic, a master of sound bites and palace gossip. He cultivated an image of being close to Rajiv, of understanding what the youth wanted. When policies were debated, he mocked Rao's long, carefully argued notes as professorial lectures. "History moves fast, sir," the rival would say with a half-smile. "We can't read every book before we take a decision." Rao, who had built his entire life on the belief that decisions without reading were invitations to disaster, bit his tongue more often than he spoke. There was work to be done. The Assam Accord, the Mizo Accord, quiet outreach to secessionist leaders who had spent half their lives imagining India only as an enemy. These were slow, patient processes that did not make for glamorous headlines, but which stitched together fragile peace in regions that had known only fear. He persisted. The cameras followed someone else. Then came the scandal that would turn India's most popular prime minister into a synonym for betrayal. Bofors. Allegations of kickbacks in a major defense deal splashed across front pages. Opposition leaders waved papers in Parliament. The word corruption, always present, now had a sharp foreign-made edge. Rajiv Gandhi's halo cracked. Within the Congress, survival instincts kicked in. Ministers who had once boasted of being in the inner circle suddenly discovered they had no idea what had really happened. Blame flowed in every direction, towards Swedish companies, middlemen, bureaucrats. It also flowed sideways towards senior colleagues who were now seen as expendable shock absorbers. P.V. Narasimha Rao, by then handling human resource development and using that quiet space to build a modern education policy, felt the turbulence like a slow-gathering storm. He was not central to the Bofors affair, but he was part of a government that now stank, in the public imagination, of money counted in foreign accounts. Opponents inside the party used the moment to press old grievances. "Sir," his rival told Rajiv in one private meeting, "we need a fresh team. The public is angry. We need to show change." Change in this context meant moving aside the men who reminded voters of Indira's era. Gray-haired, serious, associated with both the glory and the darkest compromises of the past decades, including P.V. Narasimha Rao. One by one, important portfolios slipped from his hands. Meetings happened without him. Briefings were routed around him. His notes, once eagerly awaited, sometimes lay unread in dusty corners of files. Outside, the electorate was sharpening its own verdict. The 1989 general election was a cold, hard slap. Congress lost its massive majority. Rajiv Gandhi, once the face of hope, became the face of disappointment. Opposition parties smelling blood united in unlikely combinations simply to keep Congress out of power. For the first time in decades, the Nehru-Gandhi family did not sit at the head of the cabinet table. In that somber winter, Narasimha Rao took stock. He was in his late 60s. His health had been fragile for years. A heart bypass in the early 1980s had reminded him brutally that even the strongest mind sits in a vulnerable body. The party he had served his entire adult life was floundering, its vision clouded, its internal discipline in tatters. Younger leaders were already jostling for space, speaking on television, presenting themselves as the new Congress that would emerge from defeat. And somewhere in the background he could still hear the voice of his rival, now a national figure in his own right, telling reporters that the time had come for a generational change. He remembered Vangara, Karimnagar, the assembly in Hyderabad, the long nights in Delhi ministries, the faces of peasants and diplomats, of students and policemen, of rioters and victims. He had done what he could in the positions he had been given. Perhaps he thought that was enough. In a small book-lined room in his Delhi house, he began to make quiet arrangements. He would not contest the next election, he told his family and a few close friends. He would withdraw from active politics. There were books to read, there were books to write, on politics, on philosophy, on the many languages and literatures that had sustained him. He started packing volumes in Telugu, Hindi, English, Spanish, commentaries on the Vedas, novels, diplomatic histories, ancient poetry. The shelves emptied slowly into cardboard boxes, each filled with a lifetime of underlined passages and marginal notes. Outside his window, the city's noise swelled and receded. Protests, processions, traffic jams, the distant echo of slogans about change and youth and the future. For the first time since he was a boy, he allowed himself to imagine a life in which he was not constantly being called to put out fires, draft compromises, or hold together crumbling coalitions. He would go back, he thought, to being simply Pamulapati Venkata Narasimha Rao, a reader, a thinker, a man for whom the world was contained in the pages of a book. What he did not know, what no one in that quiet, book-filled house could possibly have guessed, was that history had already marked his name in ink for one final brutal test. In less than 2 years, a bomb on a campaign trail would blow apart the Congress succession plan. In less than 2 years, the rival who had openly dreamed of the top job would find himself trapped in a web of his own promises. And in less than 2 years, the man who was now taping shut cardboard boxes would be summoned out of retirement, handed a bankrupt economy, a grieving party, a nation on edge, and told once again that he had only a few days, a few weeks at most, to prevent disaster. The gold moves at night. Unmarked trucks roll through the darkness towards a discreet gate in the Bombay docks, watched by a handful of nervous officials and soldiers who have been told, in flat orders, to ensure there is no incident. Inside the crates are bars stamped with the Ashoka lion, India's national emblem, hammered into solid, silent bullion. They are not being brought into the country. They are being taken out. Within days, those bars will sit in a foreign vault, pledged as collateral so that the government of India can beg for the most basic mercy: time. Time to pay its bills, time to buy oil, time to keep the lights on. In Delhi, the man who will have to answer for this humiliation is doing something that, on the face of it, could not be more different. He is writing a letter of retirement. P.V. Narasimha Rao sits at a desk surrounded by half-filled cartons of books and makes careful, almost calligraphic strokes on thick white paper. He has told his family he is done. He will not contest the next election. He will not sit in any more shouting matches in Parliament, will not spend another night poring over files in ministries that barely pretend to listen. He pauses, measuring his words. Outside his window, the city hums, unaware that the State Bank of India has almost no dollars left in its accounts. That credit rating. Agencies abroad have begun using the word insolvent, that in hidden memos, bureaucrats are quietly calculating how many days remain before India runs out of foreign exchange completely. The answer, if someone were to thrust it under his nose at that very moment, would have been brutally precise. Less than 3 weeks. 20 days before India, the proud leader of the non-aligned movement, officially becomes a bankrupt nation. He does not know this yet. He is still only thinking of closing a long, complicated chapter of his life. Then, in May 1991, in a small town in Tamil Nadu called Sriperumbudur, A human bomb walks towards Rajiv Gandhi and changes everything. The news arrives in fragments. A blast at a rally, confusion, conflicting reports. A TV anchor's voice cracking. Then, finally, the sentence that ripples through Delhi like a physical shock. Former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi has been killed. In the Congress headquarters, people do not so much walk as stagger. Some burst into tears. Others shout, demand details, grab telephones with shaking hands. Old men who had served 3 generations of Nehru-Gandhi leadership look for the first time in their careers completely lost. In a modest house with its half-packed cartons, the phone rings and rings until someone hurries to pick it up. "Have you heard?" The words slam into Narasimha Rao like a cold wave. He had not been at Rajiv's side recently. He had been deliberately keeping a distance, his mind already turning towards private pursuits. But the bond of decades in the same party does not dissolve so easily. For a few seconds, all his personal calculations evaporate in a stunned personal grief. Then, almost immediately, a second thought follows the first. India has been here before. He had watched it when Indira fell, and before that, when Nehru's death left a void no one knew how to fill. Each time there had been a scramble, a panic, then a compromise around a member of the dynasty. Now there is no obvious heir. Sonia Gandhi is inconsolable, in no state to even consider politics. The young children, Rahul and Priyanka, are years away from public life. The Congress Party, built like a solar system around the son of one family, suddenly finds itself spinning in the dark. In that darkness, ambitions flare. Within hours, one familiar figure steps forward, or rather circles closer to the center, careful not to appear too eager, the rival. He has been there in the background for years now. The same man who once undermined Rao in Andhra Pradesh has patiently built a national profile, holding economic portfolios, charming. The media cultivating a reputation as a modernizer with impeccable secular credentials. He is articulate, photogenic, and crucially, he has never publicly crossed the Nehru-Gandhi line. Privately, he has long believed that the top job should have been his. Now, sideways glances in Congress corridors carry an unspoken question. Is this his moment? For a breathless few days, Delhi becomes a whispering city. In drawing rooms and party offices, names are floated, tried on like costumes, discarded. Some talk of holding the position in trust for the next Gandhi. Others demand a completely new start. Regional bosses from the states make their own calculations. Who will listen to them? Who will sideline them? Who can win? Through it all, Narasimha Rao listens more than he speaks. He has not put his name forward. If anything, his withdrawal from active politics has made him seem like a man already walking away from the game. But his very distance now looks to some like an asset. He is not tainted by recent scandals. He is not seen as a direct threat to Sonia. He is not young enough to build a permanent alternative dynasty. He is, in other words, safe, a compromise. The rival understands this logic and moves quickly to strangle it. In private conversations, he shakes his head, voice heavy with concern. Rao Garu is a scholar, he tells any senior leader willing to listen, using the respectful suffix while quietly reducing him. He is unwell. He was packing to retire. This job needs energy. It needs someone who can take on the opposition, electrify the party. This is my duty. I am ready to sacrifice. Sacrifice. The word is chosen with care, but there is someone watching this theater who has seen such performances before and survived them. Sonia Gandhi grieves in silence, but when senior Congress leaders come to her with their whispered suggestions, she makes one thing absolutely clear. She will not be drawn into naming a successor. She will not bless any single claimant to her husband's chair. In that vacuum, the party turns, almost by reflex, to the one man who seems least likely to threaten anyone else. Rao Saab, they say, you must take responsibility. For now, until the elections. Until we see what the people say. He looks at them for a long moment, saying nothing. He knows what they are really asking. Not just to hold the steering wheel, but to be a shock absorber for the next blow that is sure to come. His doctors have warned him about stress. His heart, with its bypass scars, is a quiet metronome in his chest, ticking out a reminder that no amount of willpower can erase. But beneath the fatigue, something else stirs, a sense of unfinished duty. His entire life, he has been handed crises with too little time and too few tools. Each time he has told himself that his job is to do what he can, where he is, with what he has. Now, for the first time, the where is the whole country. He nods almost imperceptibly. "I will do what I can," he says. It is not a dramatic acceptance. There are no grandiose declarations. But for the man from Vangara, this is the moment when retirement ends and the final brutal chapter of service begins. The election of 1991 is stained with blood and uncertainty. Campaigning is halted for days after Rajiv's assassination, then resumes under a cloud of sympathy and anger. The Congress gains from the wave of emotion, but not enough to regain its old dominance. When the ballots are counted, the result is delicately poised. Congress is the single largest party, but it does not have a majority. In the numbers game of the Lok Sabha, every seat is now a bargaining chip. Every small regional group a potential kingmaker or executioner. Opposition parties circle like sharks, hoping to keep Congress out of power entirely. The rival can barely hide his fury when, in this fractured landscape, the Congress Parliamentary Party meets and chooses P.V. Narasimha Rao as its leader. The calculus is simple. He is acceptable to almost every faction. He is not too closely tied to any one ideological camp within the party. He projects stability to nervous allies and bureaucrats. He is, crucially, the only man around whom enough people can momentarily agree. Within days, the man who had been folding away his public life walks into Rashtrapati Bhavan to be sworn in as Prime Minister of India. He takes the oath in a firm, low voice, right hand raised, eyes expressionless behind thick glasses. Outside, the gold is still moving. Reality does not wait for ceremonies. Barely has the new government taken shape when the finance secretary, the Reserve Bank governor, and a handful of senior bureaucrats sit down in the Prime Minister's office with files that feel, in Rao's hands, heavier than they look. They do not waste time on euphemisms. "Sir," one of them says, "we have enough foreign exchange to pay for, perhaps 2 weeks of imports. 3, if we stop everything that is not essential." Rao looks up, face unreadable. "And if we do not act?" The answer is a word that many of these officials have never dared speak in relation to their own country. Default. The room is so quiet that the hum of the air conditioner seems suddenly loud. Default. For a developing nation like India, it would mean not just economic humiliation, but social and political chaos. No ability to pay for oil, no ability to service debts, a collapse in the rupee, spiraling prices, panic. "How much time," he asks, "do we really have?" "Days," comes the reply. "Not months, days." There is your deadline. Not for a state this time, not for a party's survival in one corner of the map, but for the entire system of Indian democracy. He looks at the notes in front of him, proposals for pledging gold, for approaching the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, for emergency measures that would have been political suicide in any normal season. This is not a normal season. "Do it," he says. The trucks roll. The bullion leaves its familiar vaults. Economists abroad raise their eyebrows. India, the self-proclaimed champion of Swadeshi and socialist ideals, is pawning its family jewelry. But in that humiliating transaction, a small window opens. Time, a few weeks of oxygen. Enough, perhaps, to attempt something far more radical than anyone around that table has yet dared to articulate. Into this pressure cooker walks another quiet man with an academic air and tired eyes. The new finance minister, Manmohan Singh. He is not a politician in any traditional sense. He has never fought an election. He is an economist, a technocrat, a former bureaucrat who understands the international financial system with an intimacy no one else at that cabinet table can match. In another government, at another moment, he might have been left to tinker at the edges. Rao does not have that luxury. He ushers Singh into his small, paper-strewn office, closes the door, and in his unhurried way, puts the question that will define both their careers. "If we are to avoid this happening again," he asks, "what must we do?" Singh speaks of structural problems, an overregulated economy, a license raj strangling enterprise with red tape, public sector, giants bleeding money, trade barriers that have protected inefficiency instead of nurturing competitiveness. He speaks, too, of the political landmines attached to each of those problems, subsidies that keep the poor afloat, but also feed corruption, state-owned companies that are workplaces for millions and also symbols of national pride, import duties that shield domestic industries and also keep goods expensive for ordinary Indians. Every solution involves pain. Every necessary reform cuts across some entrenched interest group, some vote bank, some sentimental attachment to the old promises of socialism. Rao listens silently. He already knows in his bones what an India of queues and shortages looks like. He has lived through it. He also knows just as deeply that the world outside has changed faster than Delhi's slogans. Within hours, he calls another, smaller meeting. I want, he says, a budget that tells the truth, and a plan of reforms that will prevent us from facing this shame again. You, he nods at Singh, will be the architect. There is, he adds, a clock. Within 4 weeks, Parliament must see a budget. Within 4 weeks, investors and creditors abroad must see a roadmap. Within 4 weeks, his own party must be persuaded or bulldozed into accepting changes that will overturn 4 decades of economic orthodoxy. If they fail, no foreign power will have to topple his government. The numbers will. The rival does his calculations quickly. At first, he sees opportunity in the crisis. A fragile minority government, a leader with no personal mass base, a party still reeling from assassination. What better setting for a strong alternative to emerge? He takes to the television studios, eyebrows knit in appropriate concern. We must save the country, he intones. But we cannot abandon the poor. We must be careful not to sell out our basic commitments. The word sell out hangs in the air like a warning shot. Inside party forums, he is more blunt. These reforms, he tells colleagues waving copies of draft proposals, are a betrayal of Indira Ji's legacy. Privatization, freeing prices, opening to foreign companies? Is this what we promised the people? He does not mention the gold in foreign vaults. He does not mention the 2-week deadline for national bankruptcy. Instead, he frames the coming choices as a moral struggle, loyalty versus betrayal, socialism versus heartless capitalism, Indira's memory versus some faceless IMF official in Washington. A lesser prime minister caught between hard economic facts and emotional blackmail might have flinched. Rao does not. He knows he cannot win this argument with slogans, so he chooses a different battlefield, the fine print. He allows Manmohan Singh to become the public face of reform, soft-spoken, scholarly, reassuring. In Parliament, Singh takes the blows, speaks of no other option, quotes statistics and global trends. On the streets, left-wing parties burn his effigy. Behind him in the shadows, Rao does the real political work. He calls small groups of MPs to his residence late at night, not for fiery speeches, but for patient conversations. He opens files and shows them numbers. How much is spent on subsidies versus how much actually reaches the poor? How many licenses are needed to start a simple factory? How many days ships wait in port because of outdated procedures? He does not talk of reform as an ideology. He talks of waste, of inefficiency, of the human cost of pretending everything is fine while the system rots from within. Some are unconvinced, some are quietly impressed. Most are simply tired and scared of early elections that could wipe them out. You can vote against me, he tells a few hardliners, his voice almost gentle. But then you must also be ready to explain to your voters why their salaries have stopped, why their ration shops are empty, why the rupee has collapsed. He does not threaten. He explains consequences. When the budget finally comes to the floor, it is nothing short of a revolution disguised as an official document. Licenses are scrapped in sector after sector. Import duties are slashed. The rupee is devalued. Public sector units are told they will have to perform or perish. Foreign investors are told cautiously but unmistakably that India is open for business. Outside Parliament, opposition leaders howl about betrayal. Inside, many of them who have privately read the same terrifying economic briefings temper their rage with pragmatism. In the crucial vote, enough of them sit on their hands or quietly step aside. The budget passes. India steps through a one-way door. The rival is caught off balance. He had banked on failure, on the old guard rising in outrage, on the government collapsing under the weight of its own daring. Instead, he finds that the sky has not fallen. Prices do rise, uncomfortably. There is anger in some quarters, but there is also a sudden electric sense of possibility. In Bombay, the stock market reacts like a wild animal just given a taste of freedom, soaring, crashing, climbing again. In factories and trading houses, men who had made comfortable fortunes under the old regime of licenses and quotas suddenly find they will have to compete for real. Some curse Rao in private, some quietly, grudgingly admire him. Abroad, where only weeks earlier India had been the butt of condescending jokes in financial circles, there is a new tone. cautious respect. They had expected panic, half measures, hysterical backtracking. Instead, they see a government that has done the unthinkable, use a moment of weakness to push through changes that previous, stronger governments had never dared attempt. The rival adjusts his script. If he cannot stop the changes, he will position himself as their moral regulator, attacking every perceived excess, every instance where reform appears to hurt the poor. He gives interviews, writes articles, paints Rao as a man in thrall to foreign advisors, a cold technocrat who understands numbers better than hearts. What he cannot yet see in his focus on the economic battlefield is that a different, more dangerous front is opening in the north. It has nothing to do with stock markets. It has everything to do with faith, bricks, and an old mosque in a temple town called Ayodhya. To many in Delhi's secular English-speaking circles, Ayodhya had long seemed like a sideshow, a local dispute over a disputed structure, inflamed occasionally by processions and lawsuits, then subsiding into the background noise of India's endless quarrels. But in the late 1980s and early 1990s, something changes. Nationalist leaders, sensing the emotive power of religious identity, begin taking out Rath Yatras, chariot processions, that crisscross the country, whipping up sentiment with a simple, potent claim. A temple stands beneath that mosque, and it is time to correct history. Television cameras, hungry for spectacle, oblige. Images of saffron flags and marching crowds beam into homes night after night. By the time Rao becomes prime minister, Ayodhya is no longer a local issue. It is a fuse. In the months after his economic revolution, he finds himself pulled into this other battle unwillingly, almost resentfully. He is a man of texts and treaties, not of religious symbolism. In his personal life, he has immersed himself in the Gita and the Upanishads, but as a politician, he has always preferred to keep faith out of public confrontation. Now that luxury is denied to him. The state government in Uttar Pradesh, where Ayodhya lies, is controlled by a party that has made the temple movement its central cause. They give assurances in writing that they will protect the disputed structure, that nothing unlawful will be allowed, that court orders will be respected. In Delhi, advisors are divided. Some urge force. Dismiss the state government, they say. Impose president's rule. Take control. Others warn of backlash. Do that, they say, and you will be painted as anti-Hindu. There will be riots everywhere. And remember, we are a minority government. We survive on support from some of the same parties that are sympathetic to the temple cause. The rival, for once, is strangely quiet in public, offering lofty statements about maintaining harmony while watching with keen interest how Rao will handle this explosive test. There is another clock ticking now. On a cold December day in 1992, hundreds of thousands of Karsevaks, religious volunteers, gather in Ayodhya, ostensibly for a symbolic protest. Reports start coming into Delhi that the crowd is restless, that leaders on the stage are struggling to contain them, that some have brought hammers and pickaxes, chanting not just slogans for a temple but threats against the mosque. In the Prime Minister's office, phones ring incessantly. Rao summons his home ministry team. His instructions are precise. Get the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh on the line. Remind him of his written commitments. Warn him of consequences under the Constitution if the structure is harmed. The Chief Minister repeats his assurances, almost indignantly. Nothing will happen, sir, he says. We are in full control. These are patriots, not vandals. Rao is not reassured. He weighs the option that has haunted him for days, sending in central forces, overruling the state. He thinks of the Constitution, of federalism, of the precedent it will set for center-state relations. He thinks, too, of troops firing on citizens gathered in the name of their faith, of television cameras capturing an Indian army storming a sacred site, of the spiral of violence that could follow. In his hesitation lies the tragedy. By the time it becomes clear that the assurances from Lucknow are empty, the Karsevaks have already turned into a demolition squad. On live television, the domes of the Babri Masjid begin to tremble and crack. In Delhi, a stunned silence falls over rooms where men in starched kurtas and crisp uniforms had told themselves that such a thing cannot really happen. It is happening. Brick by brick, the mosque comes down. Around the country, anger explodes. In Mumbai, in Delhi, in small towns and big cities, Hindu-Muslim riots blaze for weeks. Trains are stopped and searched. Names become death sentences. The smell of smoke and fear hangs over neighborhoods that had, only days earlier, been merely poor, not terrified. At the center of this storm stands P.V. Narasimha Rao. His critics, including his own rival within the party, do not hold back. On television, in parliament, in the streets, they accuse him of inaction, of naivety, of secretly sympathizing with the temple cause, of betraying the Constitution he had sworn to uphold. Few of them mention the letters of assurance from the state government. Even fewer acknowledge the impossible calculus he had faced. The choice between preemptive force that could have itself sparked bloodshed, and a trust in constitutional promises that proved catastrophically misplaced. In history's harsh light, explanations rarely matter. Images do. And the image that burns itself into the nation's memory is of a centuries-old mosque collapsing while the government watches from afar. For the rival, this is the opening he has been waiting for. He resigns from his cabinet post with great flourish, presenting his move as a moral protest. "I cannot be part of a government that allowed this to happen," he declares, voice ringing, eyes blazing for the cameras. "This is not the Congress I joined. This is not Nehru's India." The implication is clear. He is the keeper of the true flame. Rao is the man who let it flicker and almost die. Within the party, a chorus begins to build. He should step down. He has lost the moral right to govern. He has alienated minorities, frightened secularists, emboldened extremists. Opposition parties seize the moment and move a no-confidence motion in Parliament. The numbers are tight. If just a handful of MPs switch sides, the government falls. In those feverish days, the same man who had faced down economic collapse with a quiet, steady hand now finds himself fighting a different kind of battle, not over policies, but over survival. He does not sleep much. He meets leaders from small regional parties in his living room until the early hours, bargaining, cajoling, reminding them of projects in their constituencies, of funds for their schemes, of the instability and fresh elections that will follow if the government falls. His rival, for his part, whispers in the same ears. "Now is the time," he urges them. "Bring this man down. After that, we can form a secular government with new leadership. I am ready to serve." The night before the vote, the atmosphere in Delhi is electric. Newspapers print speculative seat counts. Television anchors talk of knife-edge arithmetic. In South Block, a single figure sits alone at a desk, a pen in his hand, a blank notepad in front of him. If he loses, his reforms are at risk. A new government could undo them, roll back liberalization, send India's economy lurching back towards the comfortingly familiar stagnation of the past. If he wins, he will survive, but wounded, battered, more isolated than ever. Either way, the next day will be decisive. He writes nothing on the pad. He simply waits. The next afternoon, the Lok Sabha's giant electronic board lights up with the results of the vote. In the end, by a margin of just a few dozen votes, the government survives. Whispers of inducements, of last-minute deals, of cash-filled suitcases changing hands in smoky hotel rooms begin to swirl almost immediately. Years later, these whispers will harden into accusations, then into a criminal case, then into the shameful spectacle of a former Prime Minister of India standing in a dock, accused of bribing MPs to save his government. But that is still in the future. On this day, as the House erupts in shouts and thumps of desk slapping, one man allows himself the smallest of exhalations. He has bought time, again, at a price he cannot yet fully see. By the mid-1990s, the contours of Narasimha Rao's India are clearer. The economy, once on the brink of disaster, is growing. Satellite dishes sprout from terraces in cities and towns, bringing in new channels, new advertisements, new aspirations. Middle-class families buy their first cars from private manufacturers, their first color televisions made by companies that had not existed a decade earlier. Computer training centers appear in quiet lanes. Young graduates speak of software and outsourcing, words that had meant nothing in their parents' time. In foreign capitals, Indian delegations are greeted less with polite pity and more with serious interest. Investors who once skimmed past the word India in briefing books now linger, considering the reforms are far from complete. Millions remain poor. Inequality widens. But something fundamental has shifted. The country's economic conversation is no longer about how to manage scarcity. It is about how to manage growth. On the foreign policy front, too, Rao moves with a subtlety that many in his own party barely notice. He opens a Look East policy, reaching out to Southeast Asian nations, weaving India into regional forums where it had once been only a distant observer. He accelerates quietly the country's nuclear and missile programs, laying groundwork that future governments will use to announce dramatic tests and doctrines. He navigates the post-Cold War world, adjusting from dependence on a crumbling Soviet Union to a more complicated, wary relationship with the United States, all without surrendering India's cherished strategic autonomy. Yet at home, his political base erodes. The rival, having failed to unseat him, sharpens his attacks, positioning himself as the conscience of the party. Regional satraps grumble that Delhi has become distant, arrogant, too enamored of markets and foreign capital. Corruption scandals, some real, some inflated by enemies, begin to cling to the government like a low, persistent smell. In whispers, people begin to speak of the old professor as tired, isolated, surrounded by bureaucrats rather than politicians, too. Slow to respond to the daily theater of democratic outrage, the calendar turns towards 1996. Another election looms. The deadline, inevitable in a democracy, is approaching again. This time it is not for the rupee or for a no-confidence vote. It is for the judgment of the people. Narasimha Rao knows that the odds are against him. The coalition that sustained him is fraying. His own party is divided, some already making secret contact with regional formations and opposition leaders, hedging their bets for a hung parliament. The rival is everywhere, on posters, on platforms, in speculative newspaper columns, with that same well-practiced line. After the election, we will need a new kind of leadership. On the campaign trail, Rao moves more slowly than in his prime. He still delivers carefully reasoned speeches, laying out what has been done, what remains, why the path of reform must continue. But cameras now prefer younger faces, catchier slogans, leaders who shout rather than explain. The results, when they come, are brutal. Congress loses heavily. The party that had ruled India like a natural phenomenon since independence now finds itself reduced, humbled, its claim to inevitability shattered. In the immediate scramble to form a new government, no one looks to Narasimha Rao. He is, in the eyes of many, already a relic, a transitional figure who steered the country through a crisis, yes, but who has no place in whatever new arrangement emerges. He knows this before anyone needs to tell him. The man who reluctantly accepted the Prime Minister's chair 5 years earlier now prepares to leave it with the same lack of drama. No tearful farewells, no bitter speeches, no public settling of scores. Yet outside the formalities of office, storms still gather. Investigations into the no-confidence vote, into alleged bribery, into scams in distant corners of the country now begin to circle back, tracing signatures, authorizations, tacit approvals. For the first time in the history of the Republic, the prospect appears that a former Prime Minister of India may be dragged into court as an accused. The rival once again smells blood. From the sidelines, he shakes his head in sorrowful disapproval. "This is painful," he tells the cameras. But no one, however high, can be above the law. He does not say the rest aloud. If Narasimha Rao falls, the narrative of the 1990s can be rewritten. Rao's economic revolution can be separated from his name, attributed instead to anonymous technocrats or to the party as a whole. The uncomfortable silent man from Vangara, who never quite fit the image of the leader the dynasty system had wanted, can be recast as a mere caretaker who stumbled into history and then stumbled out again under a cloud. But history is rarely so obedient. Even as legal notices begin to land on his table, even as party colleagues who once swore loyalty now avoid his calls, P. V. Narasimha Rao reaches instinctively for the same refuge that had sustained him as a boy in a poor village, as a young activist under the Nizam, as a minister in hostile cabinets. He reaches for his books. On a quiet day, in a Delhi now full of leaders half his age making noise he no longer needs to make, he opens a fresh notebook and writes a single sentence. If power was never really mine, he thinks, then neither is its loss. Outside, the echoes of rallies and accusations and headlines continue. Inside, a different kind of work is about to begin, the work of turning a life of fierce, complicated service into words that will outlast the motorcades and the scandals, the rivals and the deadlines, and even the crumbling of old mosques and old certainties. The man who once had a red beacon motorcade now stands in a bare courtroom corridor, leaning lightly on a wooden cane, waiting for his name to be called out like any other accused. No security ring, no sanitized distance from the public. Just a frail, aging figure in a simple, crumpled kurta, shuffling forward under the stare of television cameras that used to wait. Outside his office, not outside a judge's door. This is what the fall of a prime minister looks like up close. Inside, on a raised platform, the judge peers over his glasses at a list of names that read like a miniature version of Indian democracy. MPs, wheeler-dealers, party functionaries. Among them, one stands out. Pamula Party Venkata Narasimha Rao. The clerk's voice is flat, bureaucratic. But in the history of the Republic, the moment is unprecedented. For the first time, an ex-Prime Minister of India is being tried in a criminal case, accused of bribing MPs to save his own government. In that razor-edge no-confidence vote of 1993, outside in the blaring heat of a Delhi afternoon, reporters stand in front of cameras and speak with barely concealed excitement. The former Prime Minister, they say, faces serious charges of corruption. The man they are talking about takes his seat quietly, on a worn wooden bench, opens a thin file and begins, as always, by reading. He knows the stakes, not just prison, reputation, legacy. In the echoing chamber of Indian public memory, the labels being pinned on him now, corrupt, compromised, discredited, could drown out everything else he has done. He also knows something else. Time is not on his side anymore. Not political time measured in budgets and elections, biological time. His heart, which had carried him through decades of stress and surgery, is approaching its final chapters. Every new summons, every new headline chips away at the limited energy he has left. A final deadline hangs over him now, harsher than any economic crisis. How do you defend a lifetime of choices when the clock of your own life is running down? Back in his modest Delhi house, stripped now of obsequious visitors and urgent files, another kind of trial is taking place. On the shelves, books press against each other in 3, sometimes 4 layers. Philosophy, linguistics, novels, ancient texts. In the middle of this paper forest, he has set up a small island. A simple desk, a notepad, a fountain pen filled with blue-black ink. He has been writing for years, in private, in snatches between cabinet meetings and official tours, scenes, dialogues, characters. That look suspiciously like people he has known, ministers, party bosses, even a certain high command that floats above them all like a spectral presence. Now, with power gone and court circling, he returns to these pages with a new urgency. The novel he is finishing, thinly disguised, unmistakably real, is about an ordinary party worker who climbs against expectation and design towards the very peak of political power. He calls it The Insider. He doesn't need to spell out the irony. As he writes, the phone rings far less than it used to. The rival who once shared cabinet meetings and inner-circle briefings with him does not call at all. In fact, when microphones are thrust under that rival's chin now, the lines are coldly sharp. We must learn lessons from the mistakes of the past, he says, eyebrows knitted in righteous concern. Those who presided over Babri, over the decline of the party, must accept responsibility. He does not name Rao, he doesn't have to. Within the Congress, a slow, deliberate process is underway. The party that Rao once led now needs a scapegoat for its defeats, a neat explanation for its fall from dominance. In drawing rooms and committee meetings, a new narrative begins to harden. He lost the Muslims. He angered the old guard. He made us look corrupt. He betrayed the dynasty's ideals. The rival, of course, encourages this in measured, sorrowful phrases. We respect Raoji's scholarship, he says. But politically, there were grave errors. The twist for those paying attention is brutal. The economic revolution that has saved India from bankruptcy, that is already reshaping its cities and dreams, is no longer being told as the work of one stubborn, unlikely reformer. It is being repackaged as an anonymous collective achievement. The face that once fronted it is being gently, efficiently erased. Yet outside the party offices, beyond the gossip columns, the country itself is telling a different story. On the streets of Hyderabad, Bangalore, Pune, something new is happening. Glass and steel office buildings rise where dusty plots once lay abandoned. Hand-painted shop signs begin to compete with neon logos of multinational brands. In cramped computer institutes above noisy bazaars, young men and women stare into bulky monitors, learning languages stranger than Any of the dozen tongues Rao himself commanded, C, C++, Java. They are not looking to the government for jobs. They are looking to the world. Mornings in call centers start with a peculiar ritual. Workers practicing their American or British accents, learning how to say water and better in a way that will sound familiar to clients thousands of kilometers away. In these fluorescent-lit rooms, few know or care who P.V. Narasimha Rao is, but they are living every day inside the consequences of decisions he took against the grain of his own party under the shadow of impending default. This is one of history's slyest twists. Even as he appears on court dockets as an accused, the architecture he helped build is lifting millions of strangers out of the kind of poverty he was born into. While television panels shout about his alleged crimes, the GDP graphs he set in motion climb silently upwards. The rival who had thundered against selling out to foreign capital now campaigns in states proudly claiming credit for IT parks, industrial corridors, special economic zones, institutions that could not have existed without the very liberalization he opposed. The country has moved on. The man who pushed it to move is stuck for now in a legal and political cul-de-sac. The cases tighten around him. The JMM bribery case drags on, witness after witness. Another case, allegations that he conspired in cheating an elderly NRI businessman, Lakhubai Pathak, through middlemen, adds to the pile. Every few weeks his lawyers call. Another hearing, sir, you must attend. Every visit to court is a physical ordeal now. The heat, the jostling crowds, the low murmurs, some sympathetic, some cruel. Deco, ex-prime minister. Yet in these humiliating walks up courthouse steps lies a stubborn refusal to flee, to plead illness, to claim special privilege. He had once signed orders sending others to be tried. Now he submits quietly to being tried himself. When the lower court, in the JMM case, finally pronounces him guilty, the headline writers barely contain their glee. Rao convicted, they scream. The man who was once Mr. Clean, one columnist sniffs, has fallen like any other politician. At home, the TV flashes his face, older, more shrunken, next to the word guilty in red. He does not shout. He does not give angry interviews. He simply tells his lawyers to appeal, and then he goes back to his desk. The insider must be finished. He works now with the eerie concentration of someone racing, not against a known date on a calendar, but against a growing weakness in his own bones. Outside, sirens wail, scooters backfire, the city roars. Inside, pen scratches on paper. He writes of betrayals and compromises, of idealism and expediency, of a protagonist trapped between loyalty to a leader and loyalty to a country. He writes scenes that mirror his own private agonies. The moment when you realize that the people you are defending will happily sacrifice you if it buys them one more day of comfort. He does not name his rival or the dynasty or the party explicitly, but anyone who has watched Indian politics even from a distance will recognize the shadows cast by his words. This book will be his counter-argument in a world where microphones can be switched off, but printed pages endure. And then quietly, the legal tide begins to turn. In 2002, the Delhi High Court overturns the JMM bribery conviction. The prosecution's case, the judges say, is riddled with loopholes. 2 decades after that tense night of horse trading and whispers in hotel rooms, the law finally says what he had maintained all along, not guilty. A year later, in the Lakhubai Pathak case, he is acquitted again. The man once introduced on global stages as Prime Minister of India now hears the humbler, but in this moment far sweeter words. The accused is acquitted of all charges. There are no fireworks, no victory rallies. Most television channels run the news as a brief item, tucked between louder stories. The rival, cornered by a journalist into commenting, offers a thin smile. We respect the court's decision, he says, but the political and moral questions remain. He cannot afford now to admit that the man he helped drag through years of suspicion and innuendo has emerged, in the eyes of the law at least, clean. Within the Congress, there is no rush to rehabilitate Rao's image. By now, a new center of gravity has fully formed, the high command around which the party once again orbits like obedient satellites. In that firmament, there is room for only one narrative, the Nehru-Gandhi family as the constant heroic thread. Everyone else, prime ministers, ministers, workers, is a subplot, and a subplot that complicates the family's halo by being too independent, too impactful, too much of a self-made story, is inconvenient. It must be muted. So when Rao appears at party functions, rarely, slowly, he is greeted with polite claps, not with the reverence accorded to those who have carried the dynasty's name. His portrait is not placed alongside theirs. His reforms are praised in general terms, without dwelling on who drove them through. The rival, reinstalled firmly in the inner circle, now plays the role of elder statesman, his earlier sabotage and maneuvers blurred by time and by the party's desire to present a united face. The clock continues its quiet work. Rao is now in his 80s. Every morning he wakes up is, medically speaking, a small surprise. He spends more and more time with the only companions that have never betrayed him. Books, Sanskrit treatises, Telugu poetry, Spanish novels. He writes, translates, comments. In a country intoxicated by liberalization and globalization, he retreats into an older, slower universe where ideas travel by handwritten script, not high-speed internet. He is no longer trying to win arguments. He is at last conversing only with himself. Outside his walls, the India he helped midwife into a new era races ahead. The BJP government that followed him conducts nuclear tests, stares down sanctions, pushes highways and telecom reforms, using as a foundation the fiscal stability he restored. A Congress government, when it returns under a new face, does not dare touch the basic architecture of liberalization. Instead, it layers welfare schemes on top of a market economy whose rules Rao wrote in that desperate summer of 1991. Stock markets soar. Mobile phones, once toys of the elite, beep and vibrate in the hands of drivers and shopkeepers. An entire generation comes of age thinking of economic opportunity not as a distant mirage, but as something they can reach for with a decent education and a little luck. Most of them, if you ask, will name one or two recent leaders as the symbols of this new India. Very few will mention P.V. Narasimha Rao. Sometimes history's greatest revenge is indifference. In December 2004, a cold spell grips Delhi. On the morning of the 23rd, sirens cut through the chill as an ambulance races towards the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Inside lies a familiar face, slackened now by a massive heart attack. For hours, doctors work over him. Lines are inserted, monitors beep, protocols are followed. But there are some battles even the best-equipped hospital cannot win. By evening, the news breaks. Former Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao has passed away. Channels flash archive footage, his swearing in, his budget sessions, his rare soft smile. A few play the old grainy clip of him sitting beside a younger Sonia Gandhi, both of them clapping politely at a party event, worlds apart even as they share a stage. Statements of condolence pour in. He was an able administrator, says one leader, carefully non-committal. A scholar and statesman, offers another, ticking the usual boxes. The rival, whose political career has outlasted Rao's now by decades, stands in front of the cameras and bows his head. We had our differences, he says solemnly, but today we remember his contributions. The words float in the cold air, curiously weightless. The real judgment of how much gratitude or discomfort is felt will be visible, not in phrases, but in actions. And it comes quickly. Rao's body, wrapped in the tricolor, is brought to the Congress headquarters for people to pay their respects. At least that is what his family expects. It is what had always been done for the party's giants. A casket carried up the steps, a place of honor inside, faces wet with tears and cameras. But when the van bearing his coffin arrives at the gate, something surreal happens. The doors do not open. The casket is not brought inside the building where he once sat as party president, where he strategized, defended, and sometimes bled for this organization. Instead, the body of a former prime minister is placed on a hastily arranged bier on the pavement outside the Congress office. Outside, passing traffic inches around the crowd. Dust swirls. Leaders arrive one by one, stand at the gate, offer floral tributes, pose for cameras, and retreat back through the doors that were not open to the man they are ostensibly mourning. The message, whether intended or not, is unmistakable. You led us. You carried our shame in 1991. You took the blows for Babri. You went to court while we looked away. But in death, you will not be admitted fully into the pantheon. You will stay, symbolically, at the doorstep. His family watches, stunned. His son, grieving and furious, will speak later of this as a deliberate insult, a final act of pettiness by leaders who could not forgive Rao for existing outside the script they preferred. From Delhi, the body is flown to Hyderabad. There on the banks of Hussein Sagar, under an open sky far from the imperial lawns of the capital, his funeral pyre is lit. No memorial beside Rajghat, no samadhi among the other prime ministers. Instead, a modest ghat in the city of his political birth, where the vast, subdued crowd is less interested in party narratives and more in the fact that one of their own sons rose improbably from their dust to rule the nation. As the flames rise, the man whose surname once carried no dynastic resonance, no Gandhi, no Nehru, no label from Delhi's powerful families, begins to enter a different kind of history, not the one carefully curated in party archives, the one ordinary people tell in bits and pieces as they sit in chai shops and office canteens, trying to make sense of how their lives turned out the way they did. Years will pass. New scandals, new slogans, new strongmen will grab the headlines. Yet, quietly, the record will begin to bend. Economists looking back on the long curve of India's growth will mark 1991 as the hinge. Biographers will trace the threads of decisions taken in those claustrophobic cabinet meetings, threads that lead to IT corridors, to global CEOs with Indian accents, to a middle class that can fly budget airlines instead of standing in overcrowded train compartments. Writers who have no stake in Congress factionalism will look again at that unsmiling professorial face and see beneath the caricatures and the outlines of something much rarer, a leader who used weakness to do hard things. The rival's speeches will yellow and curl in newspaper archives. The dynasty's carefully edited narrative will show its gaps. And in those gaps, the figure of P. V. Narasimha Rao will begin to re-emerge, not as a saint, not as a villain, but as what he always really was, a complex self-made man. From a dusty village, fluent in more languages than most universities teach, who was handed a collapsing economy and a fracturing society with the instructions, fix it but don't disturb anything, and who, with the clock ticking in weeks, disturbed almost everything. In that sense, his true revenge is not in court verdicts or party resolutions or even belated honors. It is in something far simpler and far harder to control. Every time an Indian student logs onto a global university's website, every time a software engineer in Bangalore speaks to a client in California, every time a small entrepreneur gets a loan because a private bank exists in her town, every time a voter casually flips between dozens of news channels, blissfully unaware that there was once only one state-owned voice, there in those ordinary gestures a silent footnote is being written. This, too, is the work of P. V. Narasimha Rao. In the end, the deadline that defeated all his careful planning was the only one that defeats everyone. But the race he ran against it left marks on 1 billion lives. Long after the courts have closed, long after rivals have been forgotten, that is the kind of sentence history writes in ink that does not fade.